As yet another China-Africa forum concluded in Egypt, Beijing is promising more aid, loans and investments. But what drives China's growing role in Africa? A quest for a real and long-term partnership, or is it merely plundering the continent's riches? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Imran Garbda. Welcome to the program. China's to lend Africa billions of dollars in low-cost loans. It's the result of a two-day Africa-China summit in Egypt. The country's premier has gone even further and suggested China will do what so many Western countries have not: cancel African nations' debt.
We will increase Africa's financial capabilities and provide $10 billion in concessional loans over the next 3 years. We will support China's financial institutions to set up special development loans for African small and medium-sized enterprises at the amount of $1 billion. We will write off loans that will have matured by the end of this year, owned by all countries which have diplomatic relations with China or those in extreme financial difficulties and the least developed countries. We are fully confident that African countries can handle well their problems in their own way. China-Africa economic and trade cooperation is based on mutual benefit, win-win, openness and transparency. China's government will not attach any political conditions on its support and assistance to Africa, just as we have not done in the past and present.
China is Africa's second largest trade partner. In the last 8 years, total trade between the two has grown tenfold. Well, 3 years ago, China established a special fund of $5 billion to encourage Chinese investment in Africa. In 2008, total trade hit a staggering $106.8 billion, an increase of 45.1% on 2007. China's imports from Africa accounted for $56 billion in 2008. And its exports were $50.8 billion. Well, direct Chinese investment in Africa last year was around $7.8 billion. Lots of big figures there. Well, joining us today are our guests in London, Andrew Leung, independent and international China specialist. Also in London, Timothy Armitage, senior economist at IHS Global Insight. And in Cairo, Gamal Nkrumah, a Pan-Africanist and an editor of the Al Ahram weekly newspaper. Thank you, gentlemen, all of you, for joining us. Gamal Nkrumah, can I start off with you, please? Has China arrived in Africa as a plunderer or as a helpful partner?
Well, I think China has been a partner with Africa for several decades now. I think those of us who were active in the 70s and 80s remember the great Tanzam Railroad between Zambia and Tanzania, the port of Dar es Salaam and landlocked Zambia, which incidentally is one of the greatest trading partners of China in Africa because of its copper. And China is very keen on Africa's mineral wealth, like Zambian copper, for example.
Interesting that you mentioned, the past, and you said the 70s, etc. But back then, I mean, you had, it's interesting, very recently we had the fall of the Berlin Wall, the commemoration of the 20 years of the fall of the Berlin Wall. We look back to the Cold War and the fact that China's influence back then in the 60s, 70s, 80s was a lot more ideological in Africa, wasn't it? It's more just about business nowadays, isn't it, Kamal?
Yes and no. It is business, as always, but don't forget that China did avoid getting embroiled in the Cold War rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States in Africa. It has charted its own course, and now we see the fruition of that independence stance. From the very start, China pledged not to interfere in the domestic affairs of African countries, and it has conducted its business as a partner in the true sense of the word, without any strings attached to any of its aid. And this is something that African countries appreciated, that policy over the years, and China has stuck to it, and African countries have warmed up to this way of Chinese of doing business in Africa.
I wonder if it is actually no strings attached. Let's go to Timothy Armitage in London. Mr. Armitage, is that a myth that China has no strings attached related to its deals with African countries, or is there more to it? Are there strings?
As the Chinese have said, there are no conventional strings attached. It is clear that some of the aid or some of the development loans are linked to countries where they have an interest within it. This is the way the Chinese, I guess, aid and investment has worked. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because in most of these countries which they operate in, particularly these areas where they have lesser developed resources, you need the infrastructure to access the resources, and you need the infrastructure to export, and you need the infrastructure to help the local markets grow, which also helps further investment within these countries. So in terms of actual political strings attached and economic strings attached, no, the aid doesn't have that. But it is focused, and it is, I guess, it helps build on their current investment strategy on the continent.
Mr. Leung, Andrew Leung, Premier Wen Jiabao used the word selfless in describing his country's role in the continent. Is that how you would characterize it? Surely not.
Well, I think no country in the world is entirely selfless. I mean, selfless. If you name me one country, you know, I'll be glad to hear. But I think that there is one big difference between what happened before 1978, when China opened up, and what is now. Before 1978, China is much more ideological. Its engagement in Africa is linked with that. But even now, it's not entirely no strings attached. The only political string that is attached is the non-recognition of Taiwan as a separate country. So this still applies. But I think that is more China's engagement in Africa now also is a great push towards more resources as China open up, and China needs all the resources to drive its own internal industrialization. And in the process, of course, helps African countries to build up their infrastructure. So I think there are big differences here as a watershed between when China opened up in 1978, what happened before and what after. I think is a big difference.
Well, let's try and separate the idea of turning a blind eye to certain political issues and look at maybe some economic strings. Duncan Innes-Kerr, a China analyst for the Economist Intelligence Unit, says, and I quote, "The concept of no strings attached Chinese money is bandied about an awful lot. Let's be absolutely clear. Chinese money comes with strings, like a large number of Chinese workers." What do you make of that, Mr. Liu?
Of course, one of the problems of China's engagement in Africa is on the one hand, it's building up all the infrastructure, the hospitals, the schools, the railways, the highways. So they're very, very beneficial to Africa in terms of their development. But I think the challenges on the other side is that China, as you said, is seen bringing its own laborers along, and that would be seen as stealing some of the jobs from the African labor force. And secondly, the Chinese private businessmen that come along, and some of them may not even speak English, and they tend to shut themselves up in a kind of ghetto, as it were, without being closely engaged with the local community. But I think thirdly is while China is exporting a lot of the cheap products to the African communities, because that's the products they could afford, but some of these products, because of the low level of skill, is seen to be the African workers are seeing that the jobs are being stolen. In fact, that some of them feel that they themselves could be equipped with producing some of these products. So I think that in the future, China may have to consider investing in manufacturing or in outsourcing some of the low-end products to Africa so as to create more jobs for the local population.
Mr. Armitage, is this influx of cheap Chinese goods hurting local production within different countries in Africa?
I think it's definitely increasing competition between locally manufactured goods and those imported from China. And it's definitely stoking some political discontent. But you have to also recognize that the cost of producing things in China is also lower than it is the cost of producing things in Africa. And this is also another part of this relationship, is once you develop infrastructure, once you develop the financial systems, once you develop the education system and the healthcare systems, it reduces the costs of doing business, and it reduces the cost sometimes of labor by increasing technology. So while Africa at this point has issues relating to the cost of manufacturing, the cost of producing, and China, like in most of its exports to the rest of the world, produces things cheaper, what is necessary to help Africa get to a point where it can produce affordable and mass market goods is investment, and investment in these very infrastructure deficits and educational deficits that are creating these labor market divisions and these additional costs.
Now, Gamal Nkrumah, let's look at the political pairings here and the political friendships through the business dealings. Through the dealings of the past couple of years, we've seen deals with Robert Mugabe, Omar al-Bashir, very recently a $7 billion deal with Guinea's military ruler Musa Dadis Camara, days after his troops committed a massacre against protesters. That's very controversial, isn't it? It's understandable that not only the West, but people all over the world are outraged that China continues business as usual, while there's certain serious concerns regarding these nations.
Well, there are serious concerns in the West, but of course, China understands African priorities, and African priorities are development, which is and poverty eradication. And therefore, China is simply filling the gap in countries which are ostracized by the West, like Sudan, Zimbabwe, and Guinea, the countries you mentioned, for instance. And in those countries, quite frankly, if China didn't step in to assist in the development process, the people of these countries would suffer all the more.
But Mr. Nkrumah,
I would say that China is...
Really sorry to interrupt you. Fellow African countries are trying to squeeze Guinea by applying sanctions against Guinea to get Mr. Camara to make concessions. It doesn't help when China comes in from outside with a huge business deal.
Yes, but when you look at realpolitik in Africa, you see that yes, certain countries which are upheld as models of democracy, like South Africa, for instance, and other countries in West Africa, perhaps might like to apply some pressure on countries like Guinea. However, in practice, as you can see in international forums, African countries, including South Africa, including those West African countries that are upheld as models of democracy, do in the end stick together with the pariah states like Zimbabwe, Sudan, or Guinea. And in the end, you find that in international forums, which is actually what counts, that African countries rally behind other African governments, even when they don't see eye to eye with them. And this applies to China. China simply steps into filling a gap in development that Western countries are not fulfilling.
Andrew Leung, is there a price to pay for filling that gap?
I think there is naturally a price to pay for everything. There are no free lunches. But I think that what's the big difference between the approach of Western countries to the problems of development or the problems of instability? The difference between the Western approach and the Chinese approach is that the Chinese doesn't believe that you can solve these problems with confrontation or with sanctions. One typical example is, of course, is for example in the case of Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam is now changing quite positively, and it has changed not because Vietnam was invaded by the United States. In fact, the United States had to withdraw from Vietnam, but only see that now that Vietnam is developing of its own accord. And the lesson is that in order to solve some of these problems of instability or even of corruption, you need to build up the economic foundation. And without the investment, which is China bringing onto the table, a lot of the problems will still persist. So China's engagement with Africa is seen to be positive, especially China adopts a very different approach to development.
And Mr. Leung, would China be vindicated in crying hypocrisy, saying that in recent years Western governments did business while not caring about what was going on in the former Zaire, in Angola? Today, Uganda remains a strong U.S. ally despite a bit of a dubious human rights record. Would China be vindicated in saying, why pick on us, look at yourself?
Well, I think that China is not entirely turning a complete blind eye to the problems on the ground. For example, China engagement with Sudan, for example. And China is now sending peacekeeping force there and is talking to the Sudanese behind the scenes so that they would accept the intervention of the United Nations, for example. In a lot of other countries, I think that China's policy is based on a kind of negotiation and understanding each other's problems and trying to help rather than confront these problems head on, especially with military force. And I don't think that that's at the end of the day, the Western model doesn't seem to be very successful in Africa in the past. So I think that China's engagement in Africa is definitely welcome.
Timothy Armitage, the IMF says it's worried that African governments are taking on too much debt from China. I mean, the IMF is hardly one to lecture, is it, with regards to poor countries taking on too much debt?
Well, I think there's been actually a big change in policy over the last year or so, as well as over the last since 2000. As we know, a lot of African countries have received a significant amount of debt relief because they have stuck to IMF policies, which the rest of the world has also jumped on board with. By this, it's also the HIPC and the MDRI debt relief. But going forward, now once the continent has reached this point of fairly stable debt levels and solvency and both liquidity ratios, and it's got its fiscal balances in stronger order, the risk is falling back into the old traps, the old debt traps, by significantly increasing the debt financing of your deficits within the countries. Now, an important point to this is the difference between concessional loans and commercial loans. Commercial loans being much more pricey, they have a higher interest rate and it costs more to finance those. And concessional loans, which have a lower interest rate and are much more, I guess, country-friendly than the commercial loans. And this is the type of loans that we're seeing African governments going more towards. And this is a good point because it brings in all the three factors. It brings in the multilateral community, China, and also the on-the-ground capability of using those loans and going for debt in a prudent manner. I think at this point, Africa still needs to show that it can arrange its monetary and its fiscal policy in a prudent manner that doesn't affect its macroeconomic stability. This test, by increases of financing, 10 billion loan from China, but also the ramping up of debt financing by the IMF and the World Bank and other countries, it's a very big test for the continent. But a positive movement is it's more concessional than commercial loans. So at this point, it looks promising.
Gamal and Nkrumah, not all of the continent is actually resource rich, is it? So isn't there going to be some sort of imbalance here where China does business only with those who have something to give? What about the other, even poorer African countries that don't have, for example, oil beneath their soil or other resources?
Well, China has made it clear at the Sharm el-Sheikh conference that it is equally interested in social development in Africa as in economic. And for example, it has poured in a huge amount of money and technical expertise into fighting malaria, for example, in the continent. And that affects countries right across Africa, not just the mineral-rich, resource-rich countries, but also the poorer ones. And infrastructural development in Africa, also from the Chinese perspective, is more on a regional basis rather than country by country. And so these kind of investments in social as well as physical infrastructure do also help some of the poorer countries. And to cite just a few examples, Ethiopia might be one of the larger African countries in terms of population, but it's actually resource poor to compare to some of the other African countries, and yet we find that China has extensive trade, economic and development relations with a country as resource poor as Ethiopia. So I wouldn't say that Chinese aid and trade is restricted simply to resource-rich country, even though I have to admit that, yes, countries that are rich in energy resources in particular, and also mineral resources, tend to be the major beneficiaries in terms of aid and development.
Let's get some final thoughts from Andrew Leung before we wrap up. Mr. Leung, let's look forward, say 20 or 30 years. What does China eventually want from this relationship with the African continent? Where does it want to be in 30 years' time?
I think it's as my colleagues are quite right. It's not just energy and resources, because China is being regarded as the leader of the third world, for example. In the United Nations, China needs the support of all the developing countries, including those without the kind of resources. So China's engagement in Africa is more wide-ranging. But I think the challenge for China in the coming decades is to be seen to play a more proactive role on the human side, especially on things like corporate governance. And I think that China should be talking to the NGOs, for example, more often, and to help build up the kind of institutions in those countries. Of course, investment is extremely important, especially trying to drive the economies, because without the economic rising levels of income, it would be very difficult for some of the African countries to even repay some of the concessionary loans. But on the other hand, institutional building is very useful. But I think that there are lots of agencies, United Nations, but also NGOs, in which China could take a more active part.
Okay.
And I think that I think China's a more comprehensive engagement would be extremely beneficial to Africa.
Okay, sorry to wrap you up there. We have run out of time. Thanks, Mr. Leung. Thank you all of you, gentlemen. It was a pleasure talking to you, Andrew Leung, Timothy Armitage, and Gamal Nkrumah. And thank you, the viewer, for joining us here on Inside Story. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.